Tonight it's not about Yom HaShoah. Tonight we're going to talk about Operation Kedem. I have muted everyone now, so not to show any favoritism at all. If anything doesn't work, send me a WhatsApp. Hopefully I'll see it. Anyway, Operation Kedem is not one of the most well-known operations of the 1948 War of Independence. If you want to see, there is apparently, I've never actually seen this, but there is a tiny monument in the wall by Etzioni, by the Zion Gate, which commemorates Operation Kedem. I've never seen it. Next time I go there, I'm actually going to look for it. I just wanted to give a credit to Doron Oren, who I don't know very well, but he is a choker, and he's written in Ma'arif. Some of the ideas that I will present you with are taken from his research. And if you want to read the article, it's in Hebrew, it's there, and there's also a talk that he's given on YouTube. But before we understand Operation Kedem, we just need to understand exactly where we are. If you remember from a previous talk, Jerusalem's status prior to, basically from the 29th of November 1947, the UN partition plan gave areas for a future Jewish and Arab state, and Jerusalem was designated an international city, which is important to remember in the context of what we're going to be talking about. 29th of November 1947, war broke out. It was a civil war between Jews and Arabs. On the 14th of May, the British left, and in the afternoon, shortly at 4 o'clock in the afternoon before Shabbat came in, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. And immediately, Israel was invaded by the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. And we're going to be particularly concerned tonight with the face-off between the Israelis and the Jordanians. The first thing that happened was there were battles in Latrun, and the Jerusalem, which had been the siege of Jerusalem, which had been released when the Israelis captured the Castel in April. The blockade of Jerusalem was re-established. And Jerusalem again was cut off. There were Haganah, and you'll see in a moment, there were other fighters in Jerusalem. But in the old city, and we're concerning ourselves tonight mainly with the old city, in the old city there were only about 100 actual fighters that were left to protect a civilian population of just over 1,000. They held out miraculously and with considerable casualties for 2 weeks until the 28th of May, when the old city surrendered to Abdallah el-Tal, who was the general commanding the Arab Legion. What happened to the people there? 48 people unfortunately lost their lives. They were buried in a combined grave in the old city. In 1967, their remains would be moved to Har Zaitim. The men that were left there were taken into captivity by the Jordanians, and the women and children were taken to the new gate and were allowed to pass through into the Israeli lines. The 11th of June, so this is about a month after war has broken out, there is the first ceasefire. And in a minute, I'll come back and I'll talk about the sinking of the Outer Lena, which is very connected to the story of Operation Kedem. When did Operation, so the first ceasefire was a month. On the 8th of July, there was 10 days of battles, and during this period, Operation Kedem happened, and then there was a 3-month ceasefire through the summer. On the 15th of October, the war moved into its third and final stage, and this was battles on various fronts, mostly on the front against the Egyptians and also in the north. And it was in this third phase of the war where the Israelis were really in the ascendance and consolidated the gains that they had made. Okay, back to the Outer Lena. Very, very briefly, for those of you that are not familiar with it, the Outer Lena was a ship that was carrying refugees from Europe and also carrying arms for the Etzel. I should have mentioned previously that prior to the 20th of May, there were 3 paramilitary organizations, the Haganah that was associated with the Sochnut, the Jewish agency with Ben Gurion, the Etzel that was associated with Menachem Begin, revisionist Jabotinsky, and the Lechi, which was even further to the right of the Etzel, and they were even more extreme, primarily in their opposition originally to the British. So the Altalena arrived, it carried refugees from Europe, it also carried armaments to the Etzel, and there was a standoff because in that stage, Ben Gurion had already announced that there would only be one IDF, one Sahal, and he objected to arms being specifically brought for the Etzel. Eventually, off the coast of Tel Aviv, the Haganah command, the Palmach command, the Yitzhak Rabin fired on the boat. There were either 13 or 16 casualties on the boat of Etzel fighters. 3 Haganah fighters also died. And as you can imagine, and eventually Ben Gurion, Menachem Begin put a stop to it and said he won't allow civil war between Jews. As you can imagine, a lot of bad blood between the Etzel and the Haganah, which will play part of our story of Operation Kedem. As I mentioned, Operation Kedem would happen and not even a month after the sinking of the Altalena. Okay, these are some pictures from the fall of the old city. You can see the Chorva synagogue and Jordanian soldiers standing behind the wrecked synagogue. And later on, the Chorva synagogue would be blown up by the Arab Legion, as indeed all the synagogues in the old city were totally destroyed by the Jordanians. In February of 1948, David Shaltiel was appointed brigade commander of Etzioni. Etzioni was one of the Haganah brigades that was stationed in Jerusalem. Shaltiel was a interesting guy. He'd actually been in the concentration camps. He was in Dachau. He actually came to Palestine in '36, and he was sent by the Haganah back to Europe, and he was actually in as I mentioned, he was in Dachau. And he very much reported directly to Ben Gurion. Although Ben Gurion had absolutely no military training at all, he very much wanted to remain in control of what was going on in Jerusalem, much to the chagrin of the Palmach, and particularly of Yigal Yadin, who was effectively the Ramatkal, the chief of staff during the War of Independence. On the 28th of May, as I mentioned, the old city fell. And during the 11th of July to the 12th of July, which is the period of the 10-day battles, what was going on? Well, the Jordanians were, there's a mistake here, it should be the 11th of July, 12th of July. The Jordanians were shelling North Jerusalem and effectively consolidating their positions in the north and the east of the city. And the Israelis, the Etzioni Brigade, were involved in fighting in the west of the city, in Har Herzl, Kiryat Yovel, and Kerem, despite the fact that Yadin, again, wanted to use Etzioni to help with the efforts that the Palmach were making to open the road to Jerusalem and secure Sheikh Jarrah, which was a strategic position which would control the Mount Scopus. And this the Palmach viewed as much more important. Ideas of retaking the old city. Shaltiel at this stage seemed open to the idea, but he preferred to work on a kind of siege strategy, whereby the Israelis would consolidate in the west and would squeeze the Jordanian legion. So he thought, okay, eventually we'll surround the old city and perhaps we'll get the old city back. Not a priority. If it happens, it happens. But on the 15th of July, suddenly Shaltiel, with an amazing change of mind, he meets with army's senior staff, including Yadin, and he announces a plan that he has to retake the old city. This was completely a bolt out of the blue. Where did it come from? Perhaps from ideas that had come from Amichai Feiglin, who was a leader in the Etzel, who'd been trying to, he'd been surveying the city and purveying ideas that perhaps the Etzel independently would recapture the city. The Etzel, most of the Etzel at this stage, a lot of the Etzel's fighters were concentrated in Jerusalem. So Shaltiel comes up with his plan to recapture the old city on the 16th of July. How's he going to do this? Well, he's going to use something called konasim, which is basically limpet mines, naval mines, which were adapted by the Hebrew University. And they thought that they could use these enormous mines to breach the walls of the old city. Obviously, the walled city, the Jordanians built up defensive positions. Where did they do this? At the gates, where any attack would come. So this was hoped by Shaltiel would surprise them and allow the Israelis to capture the cities. The idea was that Etzioni, the Haganah, would breach the walls using these mines near Zion Gate. The Lehi would do the same thing near the New Gate. And at the same time, the Etzel would storm through the New Gate, and all the combined forces would meet up somewhere near David's Tower at Jaffa Gate. The plan was vehemently opposed by Yadin and all the senior officers of Tzahal. However, Shaltiel ignored Yadin. He went over his head directly to Ben Gurion, and he received approval for the plan by Ben Gurion. But at the same time, on the same day, Abba Eban, who was Israel's ambassador to the UN, he announced that the UN was going to force through a ceasefire on all parties that would come about within the space of 2 days. By the way, ceasefire is if either of the parties didn't listen to the ceasefire, there would be sanctions on those countries. On the 15th, however, Ben Gurion still approved Shaltiel's plan, and in a document that has been released from the archives, shows Ben Gurion was concerned mainly with one thing: במקרה שתצליח בכיבוש העיר העתיקה, יש סכנה חמורה והרת אסונות מחיילינו שישדדו ויחללו מקומות קודש נוצריים ומוסלמים. This is what Ben Gurion was mainly concerned with: the risk that our soldiers would take the advantage basically to rob the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of gold. And he gave a specific direction to Shaltiel. He said, put soldiers in position. Their job is, if our soldiers go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or presumably the Temple Mount, and start robbing and pillaging, you are to shoot those soldiers. On the 16th of July, the morning of the Operation Kedem was due to happen, Ben Gurion is informed that the ceasefire in Jerusalem will start at 5:45 on the next morning. And Ben Gurion informs the government that in 24 hours, there's absolutely no chance of recapturing the old city. In the afternoon, Yigal Yadin orders Shaltiel to concentrate on capturing Sheikh Jarrah, which will make sure that the Mount Scopus, Harat Sofim, stays in Israeli hands. Shaltiel decides to ignore Yadin and proceeds with his plan to capture the old city. And so on the night of the 16th, at 11 o'clock at night, there is an enormous artillery barrage, 500 shells launched by the IDF on the old city. Now, 500 artillery shells in our day, if we think of attacks on Gaza, is a lot of shells. But in those days, where the IDF barely had any artillery pieces, this was a massive, massive and serious attack on the old city. At 2:30, the Etzel stormed the New Gate, but the Etzioni, the Haganah Brigade, only arrived at Zion Gate at 2 o'clock in the morning. And there was a delay for reasons which are pretty unclear. There was a delay in bringing up the mines. At 5 o'clock, the mines were deployed by Etzioni and Lehi. But in both cases, both at Zion Gate and at New Gate, they both failed to breach the old city walls. The walls were, seems stronger than, well, in any case, the mines did not work. 5:45, the ceasefire comes into effect, and Shaltiel orders all forces to withdraw. There was one casualty, which was one dead fighter, was an Etzel fighter who was killed. And now to conclusions and recriminations. The recriminations are mainly on the side of the Etzel. So Mordechai Ra'anan, who was the commander of the Etzel forces in Jerusalem, he wrote as follows: Shaltiel lo rak mana mishloach tigboret, elo gam mana sior benesiga. התברר לי שכוונת המבצע הייתה לגרום לנפילתם בקרב של לוחמי אצ"ל ולח"י ולחיסול הארגונות העצמאיות בירושלים. Okay, Ra'anan said that the whole idea was that the Etzel and the Lehi would be wiped out by the Jordanians and would cease to be able to act as an independent source. In the same vein, Yehuda Lapidot, who commanded the Etzel that night, who led the force that stormed the new gate, he wrote as follows: Mivsa Kedem lo nichshal ki lechatchila lo noad likbush ha'ir ha'atika. הרעיון של המבצע קדם לא נולד אלא כדי לפתות את האצ"ל למבצע משותף כביכול, ולמנוע ממנו על ידי כך פעולה עצמאית לכבוש את העיר העתיקה. So Yehuda Lapidot wrote, the whole idea of this joint exercise by Shaltiel was to prevent the Etzel attacking the old city independently, and it was a ki'ilu exercise, okay? The whole thing had no chance of succeeding, and the whole thing was done by ki'ilu and wasn't a real attack. And if we look at the case for the defense, Ben Gurion himself was a great champion of Jerusalem. Okay, it was Ben Gurion that said, without Latrun, there's no road. Without no road, there's no Jerusalem. It was Ben Gurion that insisted on attacking time after time at Latrun to make sure that the road to Jerusalem stayed open. But Ben Gurion perhaps was not a great champion of the old city. He certainly didn't have the emotional attachment to the old city which the leaders of the Etzel had. They were emotionally attached, and they had a religious attachment to the old city, to the Temple Mount, and to the temple as well. And the attitude of Ben Gurion to the old city was complicated and certainly changed during the course of the war. But the fact that the Mivtza Kedem didn't work doesn't mean it wasn't a genuine attempt to capture the old city. Failure doesn't necessarily indicate lack of intent. And according to to Doron Oren, the massive artillery bombardment, which was undertaken by Shaltiel, by the IDF, indicates that the intent of the Yishuv was serious to try and retake the old city in 1948. And to conclude, I give you what I think, but you can relax. It's not just what I think. A lot of other people think the same thing. So by the time we got to July 1948, the position on the Jerusalem front was acceptable both to the Israelis and to the Jordanians. The Jordanians had gained the West Bank, they'd gained the old city, they'd secured the holy sites, and the Temple Mount was in their hands. On the Israeli side, the Israelis had secured the western half of the city. They brought about relative security to 100,000 residents. That was a sixth of the entire Israeli population in Israel. And perhaps also of importance, they hadn't, the whole of 1948, as we talked about in one of my other talks, Transfer, was about removing Arabs from the Jewish state. And it's uncertain and in fact doubtful whether Ben Gurion wanted to have within a Jewish state the Arabs of Eastern Jerusalem, and certainly he didn't want the Arabs of the West Bank. And so it was that after this time, there was almost no fighting between the Jordanians and the Israelis. And in September, there was a meeting between Moshe Dayan and Abdallah Tel, who was his Jordanian opposite number. They took out a map. Moshe Dayan drew with a green pencil on the map. Abdallah Tel drew with a red pencil. They drew the Jordanian and the Israeli forward lines. And in 1949 at Rhodes, exactly this map would be adopted as the permanent ceasefire lines between the Israelis and the Jordanians. And that was the situation with a divided city that would mark life in Jerusalem between 1949 and 1967, when obviously the situation completely changed.